This is AM Agenda. Thanks for your company. With me now, Liberal frontbencher Steve Ciobo in Brisbane. Steve, another concerning development at the Manus Island facility in PNG last night. A number of people suffering serious injuries, according to the Immigration Minister.
Well, what we saw last night, based on the advice that I've received, Kieran, is that we saw some detainees breach the perimeter fence. We know that there were some transferees that had absconded effectively, but I'm also informed that the personnel that worked there were all evacuated, that those that weren't engaged in any of those activities were also taken to a different location. And so, of course, these developments are concerning. To some extent, they're understandable, but importantly, we continue with our policy of Operation Sovereign Borders and the fact we haven't had a successful boat arrival in Australia for more than 60 days.
You say that there have been serious injuries, but do we know the extent of those injuries, how many and how serious?
Look, I'm not in a position to answer that. I don't know the details around that, and obviously those questions would be best directed to the Minister for Immigration.
In terms of, you said it's pretty much understandable, and I think a lot of people would agree with you on that, Steve Ciobo, given that the group are essentially in limbo because the PNG authorities haven't finalised their processing and have not given any indication as to whether they will, when and if they'll be resettled there. So they are effectively in limbo, and you've got more than 1,000 people. It's, as you say, it's almost inevitable that these tensions will be there.
Look, these tensions are a consequence of a couple of factors. Number one, the fact that Labor effectively held out an open borders policy that saw more than 50,000 people come to Australia. People paid people smugglers substantial sums of money and they expected an outcome. Labor caused that problem. The second one, and that's a direct consequence of Labor's open borders policy, was that we actually resulted in a situation where we had so many people they couldn't all be processed. They've been put into detention centres. Now, it's been the coalition that's taken the responsible decision, Kieran, to say we are not going to let people come into Australia. We've reaffirmed our border sovereignty, and we've had 60 days now or more without any successful incursions into Australian waters. So I think that's the real source of the frustration, the reason why we see some people reacting the way they're reacting.
Brendan O'Connor, Labor put this plan in place, the PNG deal, so this would have happened, if not worse, under Labor, wouldn't it?
Well, firstly, let's remember that the flow of vessels declined by 90% because of the arrangements that we put in place. But this, of course, is a very disturbing piece of news, and it's important, therefore, I think, that the Minister really provide some information to the Australian public about what's going on.
But in terms of the unrest there, Brendan O'Connor, as I say, it was Labor that put the group of people and started the PNG deal and opened up the Manus facility for this purpose. So Labor has to accept accountability for what unfolds here too, doesn't it?
Well, we've supported offshore processing, if that's what you mean, and in fact we've supported it because we wanted to see fewer deaths at sea. In fact, no deaths if we could avoid that. These are no one's ever pretended other than this is a very complex, difficult challenge for this nation. But what you did not get from me as Minister or any of my ministerial colleagues when in government was a shutdown of information to the Australian people. Now, you couldn't get between Minister Morrison and a camera when he was in opposition. He demanded information each and every day of the then government. I think it's incumbent upon him as a minister to explain to the Australian people what is going on. There's been too much secrecy in this government, and it's important, particularly when there are very challenging issues, that the Australian public get the information from their government rather than having to read about it in the PNG media.
Let's move on. We've got a few other issues I do want to get to. We'll have more on the Manus Island situation later. Steve Ciobo, Alexander Downer reportedly going to London as the High Commissioner. Would this break a protocol, a convention between the major parties if his appointment is to cut short the tenure of the former South Australian Labor Premier Mike Rann, who's already there as the High Commissioner?
Well, look, Kieran, I'm going to disappoint you, I'm afraid, because it is just speculation at the moment. The government's not made any announcement. It's a media article that stipulates that they think that Alexander Downer is going to be our new London High Commissioner. I'm not going to comment on that, other than to say that, from my perspective, Alexander Downer is a man of incredible ability. He was arguably Australia's most successful foreign minister, and I think that however he decided to apply himself, he'd be fantastic.
Brendan O'Connor, it's hard to argue with the credentials of Mr Downer, the longest-serving foreign minister. Would be an appropriate choice, wouldn't he?
Oh, look, I'm not going to argue against the merits of a foreign minister, but I do think it's. We've seen what happened with the former Premier of Victoria, Steve Bracks, losing his position, and if they were then to sack a long-serving Premier of South Australia in this manner, that would send, I think, a terrible message about the partisan, the real sort of tawdry partisan conduct of this government to get jobs for their mates. It's not a question of merit. It's about how you conduct yourselves and how you actually treat what is, I think, a very significant former politician and Premier of South Australia, if it were to be true. So I think the government's just got to come clean and make clear that this would not be happening. If indeed it is happening, then I think it does set a terrible precedent for someone to be sacked so early for no good cause when they have been a great leader of South Australia for such a long time.
Steve Ciobo, on to the issue of Qantas. It looks increasingly inevitable the government will deliver some sort of government-backed debt facility for Qantas as part of a short-term measure. Is that a fair assessment, as reported today by Phil Coorey in the Financial Review?
Well, look, the government's having ongoing conversations with Qantas, Kieran. I mean, what I find extraordinary about the situation that Qantas is facing is this. You've got the CEO of Qantas saying, look, we are in serious trouble. We've got some real strong headwinds, not to sort of labour the pun, but we've got a situation where we can't compete on a level playing field because of the Qantas Sale Act and the situation they find themselves with respect to their debt guarantees that are in place. They've asked for assistance. Now, the Labor Party, and incidentally the Palmer Party as well as the Greens, have all come out and said, well, no, the Qantas Sale Act, under no circumstances should that be changed. I mean, the CEO wants it, the board wants it, you've actually got shareholders that are calling for this change, and yet for some reason the Labor Party seems to know better than Qantas does about what's in Qantas' long-term interests. And I just wonder, Kieran, whether we're going to see, because of the absolute stubbornness from the Labor Party and from the Greens, a situation arise where Qantas is put under even more substantial pressure, where we see increased job losses in Qantas, all as a consequence of Labor refusing to budge from their position and denying what the actual CEO of the airline has asked for. And to me, it just smacks of arrogance.
But in the short term, it's fair to say the debt guarantees the most likely scenario, isn't it?
Well, look, I mean, we've got to deal with situations as best as we can. We haven't promised Qantas anything. The Prime Minister and others are continuing to discuss the situation with Qantas. I am of the view that the Qantas Sale Act needs reform. The CEO is of the view that that should be changed. It's only the Labor Party and the Greens who arrogantly dismiss everyone and say, no, we know best, and say that they're not going to change the Sale Act.
All right, Brendan O'Connor, is it time to rethink Labor's approach to this, because it doesn't seem to be working for Qantas?
Well, Steve must have been taking his indignation pills this morning. But look, we haven't yet to hear a plan from the government. Qantas clearly has some challenges. It's a very cutthroat industry, aviation, but this country, we're big enough to have our own national carrier. That's why we have majority ownership. Let's hear what the government has to say as to what plan it wants to put in place. The opposition will work with the government to protect the interests of this national carrier, this iconic company. But we want to see the government put its plan to us first, rather than carrying on like Steve just did then. I mean, we want to see what the proposal is before we respond. I think that's reasonable.
So you're open to the change to the Act?
Government, and the government's got to start acting like a government, not an opposition.
So you're open to the change of the Qantas Sale Act then? Or is that a shift in position from you this morning? Because if you're open to what the government's put forward, we know what they're putting forward.
We've said we'll look at. No, we do not know what they are putting forward. There's no point leaking to the newspapers your view. Stand up as Prime Minister and Treasurer and explain your position to the Australian people. I mean, there's so much secrecy in this government. The only time anyone gets any information is when it's actually leaked to a newspaper for a splash that day. I've read the newspaper, but I've not heard anything directly from Mr Hockey or Mr Abbott about the proposal the government has for Qantas. Let's hear it. We will then respond. We are great supporters of Qantas, and we believe Australia has every right to have a national carrier, just like so many other countries. But you see, the inconsistency of this government, where it turns its back on so many workers and so many iconic companies, has got itself in a muddle over Qantas.
A couple of other quick issues. For the renewable energy target review, some in the clean energy sector, Steve Ciobo, are worried about the makeup of the panel. Dick Warburton, the former Reserve Bank board member, says, I'm not a denier of climate change. I'm a sceptic that man-made carbon dioxide is creating global warming. He's heading up that review into the renewable energy target, Steve.
Well, I think for starters, they're quite separate issues, Kieran. I mean, the renewable energy target within Australia and the extent to which there should be a subsidy in place is an entirely separate issue to whether or not mankind is making a contribution towards climate change, or whether it's a function of other natural factors. So I think it's important to separate those two. The reality is, when you look at the renewable energy target, it's an uncontrovertible fact that it is pushing up the cost of electricity production in this country. Now, there are those who say, well, yes, we should push up the price of electricity production for more renewables because it's the moral thing to do, and some people hold that point of view. From our perspective, though, my concern is this. We need to closely look at what we are doing to Australia's competitiveness. You see, Labor talks big on the need to create jobs. Labor talks big about what's this government doing for jobs. But when you look at what we're actually doing for jobs, which is trying to abolish the carbon tax, trying to abolish the mining tax, to make Australia less regulated, and to actually put in place business conditions that are going to help improve profitability and improve opportunities for new work and new jobs, typically Labor stands in the way on each of them. Now, the renewable energy target, given electricity is such a significant input into businesses across the country, is an important factor to take into account when we look at what is happening to electricity prices and whether Australia remains internationally competitive.
Brendan O'Connor, the government did promise this when in opposition. They were going to have a review, and now they're delivering it.
Well, I guess the reviewers, come into question somewhat, because you have in Mr Warburton somebody who doesn't believe there's a correlation between man-made carbon dioxide and climate change. I mean, he effectively says he doesn't believe the science is settled on what is an axiomatic fact. That, of course, undermines the review because of how conflicted he is with fact versus fiction. This is to that extent, it's a real problem. You can review renewable energy targets, but let's remember too that there are renewable energy jobs out there, which will be which are important for, and they're the emerging industries. But beyond that, Mr Warburton has made very clear he doesn't believe there's a causal link between man-made carbon dioxide and climate change. And how can you have him therefore review the RET?
Okay. Brendan O'Connor, Steve Ciobo, gentlemen, have a good day. Appreciate that this morning. A quick break on AM Agenda.